We'll begin this morning in James by reading James chapter 3, verses 1 through 5, or the first part of verse 5. Not many of you should become teachers, my brothers, for you know that we who teach will be judged with greater strictness. For we all stumble in many ways. And if anyone does not stumble in what he says, he is a perfect man, able to bridle his whole body. If we put bits in the mouths of horses so that they obey us, we guide their whole bodies as well. Look at the ships also. They are so large and are driven by strong winds. They are guided by a very small rudder, wherever the will of the pilot directs. So the tongue is a small member, yet it boasts of great things. It's a good time to, as we move into chapter 3 here, and especially as dealing with the tongue, it's a good time to stop and remember what, for me, has been I have taken as the theme of James's letter so far. The demand placed on the believer to have a wholehearted, undivided devotion to God. From the very beginning, he says the goal of the believer is to be whole, perfect, complete. The opposite of which is to be divided, to be double-minded, to want both God and something else as well, and not have that wholehearted devotion to God. So in the epistle, James is going after things that divide us, things that hinder us from being undivided in our devotion to God, both in the individual and in the church community. Showing partiality divides the body, divides the church. Those who separate faith from works are trying to divide an inner spirituality from outward actions, and therefore divide the believer, which in turn divides the church into those who have faith and those who work. And now in chapter 3, he's touched on the tongue before, but now in chapter 3, he gives his full attention to the tongue, which among all the things we possess has one of the greatest powers to divide and destroy. And I think he's going to say both divide ourselves individually and divide the body at large. He begins, though, with a very helpful admission here in what we're looking at today. For we all stumble in many ways. I find that as I read James, quite a breath of fresh air, because James has been so demanding and exact. If you're following God, you are to be perfect, whole, complete. And of course, well, I myself read through James and find myself very incomplete and unperfect. And I find it refreshing that James admits here that we all stumble in many ways. But James is not making this admission just simply to pat us on the back and say, I know it's okay. It's okay to stumble. Go ahead. You can keep doing it and stumble away. We're all just human. He makes this admission in order to push us further towards perfection. We all stumble in many ways. And if anyone does not stumble in what he says, he is a perfect man, able to also bridle his whole body. And it is this perfection that he has said time and time again that we are to be pushing for. The word perfect here is the same word used twice in verses 3 and 4, where he says let steadfastness have its perfect work, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. He uses this word again, perfect, several more times throughout chapter 1 and in chapter 2. It's a favorite word of his throughout the book. And this is what we're aiming for. This is what we're heading for as Christians. Now we may find it a little confusing what he means to say if a man is able to control his tongue. then he is a perfect man, able to control his whole body. So to help us out, James gives us a couple of illustrations. Horses with bits in their mouth, and ships and rudders. If he says horses, or if you can control a horse, not a bit in his mouth, and if you can do that, you control his whole body as well. And so ships who are large and tossed about by the waves of the sea are controlled by a small rudder. Both illustrations picture large and powerful things, controlled and guided by something much smaller and seeming far less less powerful than the thing that it is controlling. Yet, no matter how powerful they may seem, or how much they may seem to just look, if you've ever worked with a horse's bridle, and you look at a bit and a bridle and a horse, it's a little bit harder to imagine that I'm going to be able to control that horse by using the bit. But in the sense, you fight a horse. I spent a long time riding horses. You can fight a horse, but if you have the bit and control of the bit, you can have, in a fair amount, control of the horse, and it does work. So looking at a small rudder, you wouldn't think, I'll be able to control a large ship and guide and direct a large ship with the rudder. But it does go a long ways to having control over the ship. The one who has control over the bit in a horse's mouth, or has a hand on the helm of a ship, controls the direction of these huge beasts. So James says, it is with the tongue. The man who controls his tongue is perfect, able to control his whole body. If a person is able to control his tongue, he's able to control the direction in which he is headed, which should be for the believer towards perfection and completion and wholeness. If a person is unable to control his tongue, then there is no reason for us to believe that he's going to be able to control the direction in which he is headed. He will be a double-minded man who is tossed about like a wave in the ocean. I know this to be true in my own self. Often at this time when I think I have a fairly decent control over my life and where I'm headed spiritually, my union with God and my devotion to him, I will wind up, and I'm not a person who, you may not believe this because I talk all the time to you, but privately, I don't talk a lot. I'm a fairly taciturn person. But even for someone who doesn't talk a lot, there are times I just come out and I just say something that's incredibly stupid. And I know it's stupid. I shouldn't say that. It wounds, it hurts. It's wrong. And it is in those times when I reflect that my words, what I have said, how I have not controlled my tongue, reveals to me directions in my life in which I'm not headed towards wholehearted devotion to God, but rather I am double-minded. It reveals to me some direction in my life that I'm headed wrongly, where I'm not committed to God. The tongue shows that. And my inability to keep myself from saying those things which hurt and wound and divide show in my own self division. So if there's going to be unity and wholeness in the individual, we must be able to control what we say or write. Now, what I'm about to say is very low-hanging fruit, but it is absolutely true. One of the hallmarks of our society is uncontrolled speech. And when I usually mean speech, we not necessarily using the tongue, it's using our pen or our phones, social media, or talk radio, or whatever it is that's out there, news. We cannot control ourselves from speaking our minds in our society. We can't keep ourselves from whatever comes to mind to putting out there for the world. And we laud this as being authentic, as being real, as just sharing our minds with one another. We are unable to control our tongues. And we are certainly, as a society, being tossed about like a ship without a rudder, out of control. And I do not think the two things are unrelated. We would be wise to stop speaking our minds in most cases. We've said before, as James talked about the tongue, in Jewish literature, there is wisdom usually comes with silence. It's the fool who babbles and talks incessantly. Rather than learning to speak our minds, I think we'd be far better suited to learn to hold our tongues and to be quiet, to live in silence for a while. Then, according to the wisdom of Jewish wisdom literature, that is where we can gain wisdom. And I think according to James, we would go far towards being wholeheartedly devoted in pursuit of God and perfection. And it is a pursuit. Let me say this, and this is an aside, but let me end with this. James has this demand for perfection, for wholeness, moving that direction. But he does not use his epistle and this push for it to intimate that if we just push the right buttons, we get it. If we just do the right thing, right? If we just humble ourselves, we're good to go. It is a process for James. From the very beginning, there is the process of going through trials so that your trials of the faith, so that you obtain steadfastness, and let steadfastness have its perfect effect. This is a process of time that happens. So this move towards perfection, this move towards learning to control the tongue, it's not instantaneous. James recognizes that this is a process that is, I think, a lifelong process. But it does certainly help to take the time to be quiet, to listen, just be quiet before God and learn to control our tongues, to not talk so much. So I encourage us to do this. If we're going to move towards what James says is going to be the position, the place of a true believer, then we must be able to learn to control our tongues. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit.